Hello, everyone. Welcome to Folkmoot's online cultural crash course. This program is hosted by Folkmoot USA of Western North Carolina. Folkmoot is currently located in Waynesville, and programs are currently available online at folkmoot.org. Folkmoot is a nonprofit organization that fosters the vibrancy of many cultures into one community. As an organization, Folkmoot values diversity and inclusivity. Folkmoot also recognizes the importance of cultural exchange to create peace, prosperity, and understanding. Hello, my name is Yatanya Basharon, and I am the current programming assistant at Folkmoot. I will be introducing the presenter this evening as well as giving the concluding remarks. Also joining me for this event is Bill Graham, the Marketing and Programming Coordinator at Folkmoot, and Waleed Kahil, Folkmoot's current intern, and he will be moderating the questions for this event.
Hello everyone, I'm Waleed. For this event, we ask all participants to stay muted during the duration of the presentation. And be sure to send any questions or comments that you might have to me personally in the chat, for I will read them to Dr. Caravelis at the end. Acknowledging that this is a sensitive and controversial topic, we ask all participants to be kind and respectful towards one another, and the use of any malicious or offensive language will result in the immediate removal from this course. Thank you, and I hope you all enjoy.
Cultural Crash Course are Folkmoot's popular series featuring lectures from local experts on a variety of current cultural issues, such as global politics, race, immigration, gender, climate change, technology, and multiculturalism. Our presenter for this evening is Dr. Cyndy Caravelis. Dr. Caravelis is a professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Western Carolina University. She has earned her BA, MS, and PhD at Florida State University through the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Her expertise in criminology has driven her to explore the relationship between social threat, social control, the effects of inequality on crime, social justice, and the death penalty. Dr. Caravelis has also made great contributions to the criminal justice system in the state of Florida. Formerly serving positions as a legislative analyst for the Florida Commissions on Capital Cases, as a crime intelligence analyst for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and as an academic instructor in both male and female correctional institutions. Today's Cultural Crash Course talks about the Black Lives Matter movement. The Black Lives Matter movement is an organizational movement that advocates for the non-violent civil disobedient protest against the instances of police brutality against African Americans. With a total of 16 chapters in the United States, the Black Lives Matter organization has been dedicated now more than ever to the social, economic, and political equality of Black people from all walks of life. Sharing her insight on the Black Lives Matter movement and injustices within the criminal justice system, please help me welcome Dr. Cyndy Caravelis.
Fight back. And so Black Lives Matter is kind of bridging this gap between let's move the chains, let's move the ball, and let's do so using a number of different grassroots organizations to do it. Now, one of the kind of criticisms of Black Lives Matter is that people say, well, what about everybody else? Well, if you actually listen to a lot of what they say, they consistently reiterate that while state violence is not restricted to Black victims, violence against people of color has deep historical roots in the United States, and that Blacks continue to be the specific targets of violence. So their emphasis is, hey, state violence is a problem, but obviously their focus is on the inclusion of Black lives. So they have some goals. And the goals of the Black Lives Matter movement are numerous. I'm just going to touch on a few tonight, and I'll link up some pages for you if you want to read a lot more about this. But keep an overarching idea here that if you look at the criminal justice system, 56% of the incarcerated population are Black or Latino, even though they only comprise 30% of the general population. So there's a gross overrepresentation of Blacks or minorities in general, Blacks and Latinos in the system. Broadly speaking, the Black Lives Matter movement wants to curtail the criminal justice system and expand social services. And I'll get to that a little bit later about what they really mean. So if you, and I can drop a link later, but if you go to this website that's called joincampaignzero.org, it's Campaign Zero is a police reform campaign that's proposed by many people associated with the Black Lives Matter movement. And they advocate a number of suggestions for reform, which includes the ones that I'll highlight tonight are re-examining use of force policies, and then increasing both anti-bias training and de-escalation training. So in aggregate, these reforms should promote practices that improve residents' trust and confidence in the police while emphasizing public safety over crime fighting. In our policing classes, we look at all the different waves of law enforcement, and what's really interesting of policing, what's interesting is that in the civil rights movement, when that kind of spiked, what happened was that we had kind of gotten into this, police officers in their cars patrolling, we'd militarized law enforcement, and after the civil rights movement, which people were watching on their televisions with dogs being released and hoses being turned on people, we had shifted to more of a community model era in the 80s where we put DARE officers in school, and we had had town hall meetings with law enforcement officers. Well, as you can see, based on police response in the last decade or so, we've kind of crept back up to this riot gear, system, and I think it's actually exacerbating our issues versus getting everyone to sit at the table and talk. So first and foremost, if we look at police use of force, it's guided by something called the use of force continuum, which may vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And you can Google this thing called the use of force matrix, and it's this pyramid chart, and what it shows you is if a civilian is doing this, an officer can respond with this. And there's this little stepping stone interaction. So if you've ever been confused by the lack of indictment, so you see an interaction, you see what you think is abuse of force, but there's no indictment. The police officer did not get charged. And you go, what is going on here? What's going on is that the police use of force statutes are very permissive, meaning the legal force available to them is way higher than civilians would think it is. So does that make sense? So we don't really realize how much force that they can use legally. And frankly, most police officers don't use all the legal force available to them because it's not needed. So if we want to change how much force officers can use, we need to overhaul the policies that control it because they are using the tools available to them. So if we want to change the behaviors and the interactions, we need to overhaul the policies that govern this. The second point here of one of the BLM goals that they have is they encourage officers to receive implicit bias training. Now, implicit bias is one of those phrases that we hear a lot, but we maybe aren't really sure what it means. And what it refers to are these attitudes and stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. So this is really challenging because we're not even aware that we have these biases in place. And these biases, which encompass both favorable and unfavorable assessments, are activated involuntarily. So without our ability to control it or an awareness of it, unless we dig deep enough to kind of pull it out. One thing I say all the time that I think initially people think is really controversial is that what I say is, look, everyone is racist. And everyone is racist because we live in a society where our systems are built in a way that we have a hierarchical structure with some people having favoritism over others. I remember reading this story a while back where Jesse Jackson, right, civil rights icon, was walking down the street at night, and he said that he heard footsteps behind him, and when he turned around to look, he was relieved that it wasn't someone who was Black, and he went, oh my gosh, I know better, and yet I still have this seeding in me. So if you've seen kind of the memes going around with the literature that says, hey, what we need is anti-racist training, that's what they mean, is this kind of awareness to kind of break down the systemic causes and roots of how we've been operating in this country to confront it, because we don't even know it's there. One of my absolute pet peeves is when people say, I don't see color. Well, of course you see color. Everyone sees color. And frankly, color blindness is not even the goal. It shouldn't be the goal. Anti-racism should be the goal. It should be that you can be different and also valued, right? Color blindness says, I don't see you. Anti-racism says, I see you and I respect you. So that's kind of the difference. So part of what anti-racism training does, and this implicit bias training, is we must actively check ourselves and our reactions to make sure that implicit bias is not at play. If you've ever seen someone and you've had this kind of visceral reaction to them and you don't even know where it's coming from, that's probably implicit bias. There's something, some trigger point in you, and you maybe can't even identify where it's coming from. So law enforcement officers, we have the tools to help them identify this so they can kind of note it and then work against it, right? Work against that kind of implicitness. The other type of training that Black Lives Matter wants to institute for law enforcement is this thing called de-escalation training. All right, so de-escalation training teaches officers to slow down, create space, and use communication techniques to diffuse potentially dangerous situations. It gives officers strategies to more calmly deal with people. If you've watched any of the videos of an everyday police-citizen interaction that's kind of escalated and ended poorly, you'll see that the officers often contribute to the escalation. It's not hard to see why. They have incredibly stressful jobs and they are constantly anticipating danger. So, I have a lot of friends who are police officers, and when we talk about kind of this danger response, so picture in your house, if you've heard like a door bang or a loud sound crash and you get up to go see what it is, every time they walk up to a car, every time they approach a civilian, they have that kind of adrenaline dump of, I don't know what's going to happen here. So they're already primed for a potentially dangerous situation. So we have to give them better training and tools to be able to identify these trigger points when things are escalating so that they can employ techniques to hopefully neutralize the escalation, to step back, to slow down, and to see what's going on here. A lot of these interactions happen in seconds, truly. I mean, it goes from 0 to 60 in a matter of a minute. The last point here is that law enforcement officers cannot and should not be the first line of response for every social ill in our communities. We have trained kids. My daughter, when she was 3 years old, something is wrong, you call 911, right? This is the training that we give people. Well, if you've ever seen a police training manual, it's already literally hundreds of pages thick. They cannot anticipate every situation and they cannot be trained for every situation. Meaning if someone is having a mental health episode, if someone is experiencing homelessness, if someone's disoriented, we have been relying too much on law enforcement to handle every single social ill that we have going on. Much like we cannot and should not expect our teachers to protect our children from mass shooters and abusive homes and now infectious diseases, we can't expect our officers to be addiction and homeless experts. We have to have more robust social service responses so that officers are reserved for a more narrow set of responsibilities. So a lot of people who probably heard that there was a Black Lives Matter talk going on probably went, ooh, this could be dicey, right? And that's because it's considered a loaded term. It's considered a loaded movement. And so the Black Lives Matter movement has faced considerable pushback from various groups and individuals. And I think the primary pushback stems from a misunderstanding. Okay, so if you don't take anything else away from this talk as I've been rambling, please hear this. I think this is kind of the underlined point. People take exception to Black Lives Matter as a statement because they have inserted this word that isn't in the slogan, but they've put it there. They think that Black Lives Matter is asserting that only Black Lives Matter. See that silent word? Only Black Lives Matter, which is why people respond with, no, all lives matter, or blue lives matter. For the record, this is an example of implicit bias, but that's not the point here. I think they've misunderstood, because if there's a silent word that we should be adding to Black Lives Matter, it's what they're trying to say is, hey, Black Lives Matter too, right? We know that white lives matter. We know that police lives matter. But historically, Black lives were counted as less than a whole human, literally, right? In the 3/5 compromise, less than a whole human. Also, Black lives could be disposed of with impunity. So with the long and bloodied history at play in this country, the Black Lives Matter movement is simply asserting that enough is enough and that violence against Black bodies by the state needs to stop, right? Their lives matter too. And I think if we could just kind of all get on the same page about this one point, we would understand. We would understand the cry that's kind of being put out here, like, hey, like, time out. We can't keep suffering like this. Other responses, and yeah, I like how we're taking questions at the end here, because I've been teaching this for 11 years. And so I hear lots of, like, my students will kind of bring up these responses in the classroom. So I wanted to kind of generally respond to kind of the most frequent, hey, but what abouts, right? So one of the hey, but what abouts is, well, what about Black on Black crime? Okay. So first, I'll say this is missing the point entirely. This would be like if I went to a conference for the reduction of the prevalence of cancer and I raised my hand and said, what about heart disease, right? Heart disease is bad too. Yes, heart disease is bad too. That's not what we're talking about, right? The emphasis is on police-citizen interactions, not Black on Black crime. But if we were to talk about Black on Black crime, I would tell you that the research, and there's a lot, has found that many Black men, the group most likely to be perpetrators and victims of gun homicides, suffer from a condition similar to PTSD, brought on by repeated exposure to violence, extreme poverty, high unemployment, drugs and alcohol abuse, and other situations that create a sense of hopelessness, right? It's looking at your world from 1 inch off the ground versus seeing the 10,000 foot view. It's not being able to see outside of these situations. It is a complicated issue, and people of color very much want all communities to be safe, but these are not all issues that can be tackled under the Black Lives Matter umbrella. So when you bring in, but what about Black on Black crime? It is like putting on your blinker, taking a hard right turn, and missing the highway. Like, it's just not the highway that we're on. The second point, and this one, trying to keep my blood pressure down, this one gets me a little bit hot, is people say, well, if they didn't engage in criminal activities, they wouldn't be in that position to begin with. Not true. Many individuals who report being stopped by police or were killed by police were not engaging in criminal activity. I could name a dozen. The first two that came to mind as I was kind of, thinking this through are Sandra Bland, who was arrested for initially changing lanes without using her blinker, which for the record, I think every third car does always. And Breonna Taylor, who was killed in her house while she was sleeping for a warrant that was being executed that she had nothing to do with. And I've been, kind of nose to the ground prepping for this, but I also just heard the story of the family in Arizona who was pulled over because their tags, even though it was a different state, matched the number of a warrant, and the entire family, and they were looking for a motorcycle, not an SUV, and the whole family was put on the street face down and the parents cuffed. Here's the thing. This is not some family, right? I mean, I have a 9-year-old. To picture my child face down on the pavement crying when we have done nothing wrong is literally unfathomable for me. I cannot think about the fact that anyone has had to endure this. So that's the first point. The second point is, even if an individual has engaged in criminal activity, we have a process for this. We have arrest, we have courts, we have conviction, we have sentencing. Deadly force should be reserved only under conditions of extreme necessity and as a last resort when all other options have failed and cannot be reasonably employed. Okay, so deadly force for petty theft, or frankly, even if you look at any of the mass shooters who have left those criminal events, we still pull them in, right? We still pull them in safely to take them to court. We don't shoot them on the street, even though, it's a death penalty warranted crime. And so I think, again, if we could just for a moment slow down and really think about this, people are dying. This is not an exercise in, well, they should have known better. And frankly, we all mess up. We all mess up fairly frequently. So I think to have a little bit of grace and kind of thinking these situations through would really kind of help us get back in touch with our humanity, because I feel like it's been missing here for a little bit. Another kind of point here is that people often say, well, look, Black Lives Matter, great, fine. If only they'd march peacefully, not loot, we'd be fine with this, right? Well, please be mindful of the fact that the looters and rioters and the protesters are two different groups of people. If you look at any of the research on this, people who are showing up to protest peacefully don't see a broken light bulb and go, oh, all right, let me jump in on this. They don't, right? And frankly, a lot of the people joining the protests are frightened to do so because they don't know what's going to happen. But if we look at the looters and the rioters, they also don't have a singular motivation, right? Some people just show up to do mayhem. They do. Some rioters are lashing out because they don't feel heard. And this is by no means trying to compare my parenting with writing, but one example I give my students frequently is this idea of escalation of our response, right? So as a parent, I will often start out very politely asking my children to do things. Hey kids, load on up, it's time to go to school. Well, they're not listening to me, right? By the fourth time, if I ask them, you better believe I'm gonna probably be short and irritated, and if you were to ask them, they'd say probably me, right? I tried to reason with them calmly, and they didn't hear me, and so I escalated my response, and that's getting them in the car. If you think about riot as a response to not being heard, right? And if you think about all of these events kind of tumble on each other. So each incident, each time we hear another story in the news, it blows and it blows and it blows. And I have my students do this exercise where we have this watermelon and each person adds a rubber band to this watermelon. We do this outside. By the time, and you don't know which one it's going to be, but by the time one of those rubber bands goes on, the whole thing's going to explode, right? And that's kind of the pressure cooker that happens with this kind of buildup response. The other thing is, if you look at how law enforcement sometimes shows up to these events, they have riot gear, they sometimes have tanks, they sometimes have all of this other militarized response, and I think that fuels things. If you saw any of the responses where police officers were kneeling with the protesters, you'll see in those jurisdictions, right, the officers who were genuine in that, they didn't have violence. They didn't have this response. They helped say, hey, we hear you and we want to work with you. We want to together kind of make this better. So again, focusing on the rioters and the looters is complicated, and it only serves to shift the focus away from the message and the goal of the Black Lives Matter movement. So if I were going to conclude with just a few short sentences before we do question and answer, the first thing I would say is the Black Lives Matter movement is not anti-police. They are anti-police violence. Okay, there's a huge difference. Everyone I know that supports the Black Lives Matter movement absolutely wants law enforcement in their communities to be helping them and working with them to kind of get a handle on what's going on in those neighborhoods. Does that make sense? So it's not anti-police. This is not the message. Black Lives Matter as a movement would very much like to no longer have a need to exist, right? If we could figure this out and there's no more need for protest, I'd be like, great, because that is where we're trying to go. We're trying to get to a point where we're not on two different sides of, well, he said, she said, or they did and we did. We are trying to get to a place where we're all on the same page. They want people of color and other marginalized groups to feel safe and supported by law enforcement. That's kind of the goal. I tell my kids all the time, right? If you see a cop, you go to them for help. They're going to help you. Everyone should feel like they can do that. Finally, they want our communities to fund and deploy the appropriate social services to respond to the social ills that we face in our communities without invoking the police first. We have got to figure out a way to where we can have people who are prepared for different situations that don't require police intervention or that don't have criminal involvement, and we need to bring them in first. Because law enforcement has very little things that they can do. And if you think about it, if someone needs to go to a homeless shelter, if someone needs to go to a domestic violence shelter, or if someone needs to get help for their addiction, that's putting a burden on law enforcement to be the bridge between those agencies. So if we could essentially so if you've heard the, defund police and people are kind of having an reaction to it, what they're meaning is, hey, let's decentralize what we use as the police response and let's kind of have more social services kind of at play here. So that's kind of the crux of the lecture, and I would love to get some questions going so we could have a bit more dialogue, which we would do if we were all in person.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Ms. Dr. Caravelis, and I'm glad your expertise has brought you here and for this profound conversation. The importance of this diversity here at Folkmoot is really important, and I would like to relay some questions from the chat, starting with the first: how might the pandemic offer ways to expedite police reform?
Here's the problem. I would hope that we could all at that moment slow down and kind of take a step to really look at our resources. But the pandemic, if anything, I think has escalated what's happening because it's added this other layer of what's going on, meaning law enforcement now have heightened danger of going into different places, right, in these interactions. Now, what I maybe think it might do for us is when we look at base level issues, I mean, if we look at unemployment and we look at the fact that, I'm not sure if you saw these numbers, but the $600 check that people were being given to kind of supplement or to kind of replace the check that they lost is based on a $15 an hour minimum wage, right? Or a $15 an hour wage. That's higher than our minimum wage. So I think the pandemic could frankly put us in a place where we are doing better on the other social ills, right? On kind of getting people to recognize, hey, what we really need is better healthcare, better access to mental health services, a higher base living wage so that people can afford things and then don't go to other types of things. Does that make sense? So I'm not sure if it could help law enforcement directly. I do think that the different protests and what's going on right now. And here's the thing is, I think people who don't have regular contact with law enforcement don't recognize that a lot of police chiefs very much want to have conversations and they want to understand how to better connect with the community. I think we have charged the situation to such a degree that we don't have these open conversations. So I think maybe the pandemic and the protests that are happening within the pandemic can maybe get us all back on the same page so we can look to not just point fingers, but to move forward together and to kind of, I'm actually having conversations with a professor in social work, and we're going to talk about doing some research. Hi, Key, I know you'll watch this later, but we'll talk about some research about how she's like, hey, I don't know very much at all about what law enforcement does. So can we have a joint conversation about how social work can work with criminal justice to kind of get our students trained to better be supportive. So I think the pandemic has helped with that for sure.
Agreed. The Weeders asked, in Massachusetts, we've been considering legislation that would require police to be licensed. Mm-hmm. We're also considering assigning consequences for overuse of force. Our local police departments and police unions are vehemently opposed to this. What's your take on these two ideas for putting structure on police and use of force and consequences?
So I think first and foremost, if we want to increase certifications that law enforcement officers need to have, we need to pay them more, right? If you think about the more hours that you need in training, the more hours that you need, the higher degrees that you need, you have to offer a competitive salary. And we just don't do that. So one of the issues is that we're having a really hard time asking more of them without paying them. And frankly, I feel the same way about teachers, right? What we're asking of our teachers is incredible given the salaries that we're paying them. The second thing is, I think the way that we need to approach the consequences for use of force is we have got to shift the culture of policing, right? I think right now, if you look at kind of the basic tenets of law enforcement, and this doesn't even happen with malice intent, this happens because it becomes kind of a protect each other thing, is there is this divide between law enforcement and civilians, right? And this kind of, gosh, they think they don't support us. And the reason that sometimes law enforcement thinks that civilians don't support them is because if you're pulling someone over, even if you are 100% backing law enforcement, you're probably not happy about it, right? Like if you're getting a speeding ticket. So you're not like, hey, thumbs up, thanks, good job, guys, right? So I think we have to change the culture because I have a lot of former students for the last 20 years now who are law enforcement officers who don't feel like they can speak out against excessive force in their departments because the culture is not there for them. And this is not all cultures or all jurisdictions. I think there are lots of jurisdictions that from the top down have a structure where they really do want to change the culture and they do want to limit kind of excessive force. But in a lot of different jurisdictions, we have got to create a culture where, I hate the term good guys and bad guys or good cops and bad cops, but we have to create a culture where the good cops outnumber the bad cops, right? And so when you have a law enforcement officer that does go too far, there are people who feel comfortable speaking up without repercussion that it's going to fall back on them. So I think it's way more of a cultural shift. And I think, frankly, increasing education and certifications and salaries would help with that because there'd be kind of an empowerment structure that goes on, right? So I'm not sure how quickly any of this could happen, but I think when you use the phrases like punishment or consequences for doing something, I think there's this instant defensive pushback. So I think if we could instead phrase it as, we would love to change the culture so that law enforcement has more tools at their disposal so they can have more support and so that less force is necessary, that might be a conversation we can actually have versus phrasing it as sanctions, right? Because I think sometimes that doesn't get us off on the right foot.
True. There is a big difference between reforming the police and abolishing the police for sure. Yes. So another question, how does the rural South serve as a litmus for the 2020 election, specifically regarding police reform, and is Jackson County ground zero for 2021? I don't live very far from downtown
Silva, right? And in Jackson County, what we have going on right now is we have a lot of conversation and a lot of, frankly, a lot of tension around the Confederate statue that is at the courthouse. And one thing that I think we are not doing so well is I think we're forgetting that every person standing there, right, on both sides, is someone with a family and a home and a job and who feels a personal stake in this outcome. And that's not to say that I'm saying, oh, there's no right side or no right answer. But what I'm saying is I think if we could view the people who live among us and near us with compassion, then maybe we could have kind of a conversation about, hey, so what's really going on here, right? Because it's not about a statue. There's something bigger going on here. The rural South, I think sometimes what happens is when you have, cultural isolation, and I'm not an anthropologist, but when you have this kind of cultural isolation where you don't have a lot of exposure to, different groups of people, you sometimes don't understand what those people really stand for. Does that make sense? So we make these kind of sweeping judgments about people. And I'll say that, when I first moved here 11 years ago, I did not know anything about the rural South. I grew up in Fort Lauderdale and I lived in Tallahassee, for a dozen years or more. And what I understood after I moved here is that my students, even the ones who in the classroom are initially really resistant to it, when I tell them, hey, look, if we understand each other better, if you understand what someone is thinking when you pull them over, you will get home safer. If they understand, what you're feeling pulling them over, you'll all get home safer, right? So I don't know if Jackson County is ground zero. I still have a lot of hope and a lot of faith that we can, maybe I'll take some de-escalation training and take a step back and calm down and really kind of talk across kind of the barricades, the literal barricades that are happening, because I think we've really just set ourselves up for anyone feels like if they give an inch, they've changed sides. And frankly, let me put it this way. I think rural South in Jackson County is a microcosm of what we have done in this country and on social media. If you look at the fact that right now you can mute every single person that doesn't agree with you, right? You don't need to see what they have to say. You don't have to see their news feed. You don't have to hear anything except what you believe. The news cycles feed into that, right? So based on what news you're watching, you're getting more of this messaging and more of this training. So if we don't all just kind of get in the same rooms, get in the same space and talk about where we have commonality, I think we don't recognize that our commonality is far greater than what the differences are, right? We've just so gotten good at digging in on those differences that we have forgotten to kind of view each other as people, as, just individuals and as humans.
Very true. And another question. How can we incorporate anti-racism into schools, and how can we analyze historical narratives that silence stories of resistance?
I think the absolute worst thing that happened in the last 40 years was this era of political correctness that we ushered in the 80s, right? We stopped talking about race. We stopped having pivotal conversations. I think step one, especially in schools, we need to talk about race and difference often, early and often, because here's the thing. We sometimes as parents, we don't know when we're supposed to talk about this, right? Because we don't want to interject ugliness into our kids' lives. But here's the truth of it. My friends who are Black have to have those conversations with their kids at a very young age, right? In case someone says something to them or says something about them. So it is unfair for the race conversation to be kind of put on people who are impacted by it and not to be put on people who can choose to not deal with it, right? To not talk about it. I think the other thing is, especially if you believe in anti-racism, you have to talk to your kids about it, because other kids whose parents are also not talking to them about race are just going to pick stuff up. I'll tell you, for me, the first moment that I understood racism, and it's such a concrete memory for me, was I was riding in the back seat of the car with my friend and her mom was driving. And we were at an intersection in Fort Lauderdale. I must have been 9 or 10 years old. And as we're in this car, two young Black kids walked by and her mom hit the lock button on the cars, right? Lock the car doors. And I said to her, why did you lock the doors? And she's like, what? I'm like, why did you lock the doors? And she said, oh, this I think might be a dangerous part of town. If my parents hadn't already talked to me about kind of how everyone, has equal value and weight and all these kinds of things, if this was my first touch point with race, it would have been communicated so loud and clear to me as, ooh, that's dangerous. Does that make sense? So we have got to put in early these conversations with our kids. And, I have friends who are teachers, and I think that part of the resistance to their curriculum is this fear of the response. Like if you introduce, okay, so we have Columbus Day, what if you introduce Indigenous Persons Day? We're afraid of the backlash. And I will tell you, the backlash is real. For decades when I had children. So I used to work for the career criminal unit, the sex offender unit, the missing children unit, and the death penalty unit, right? Like none of those are preschool. I was very afraid to give interviews. I was very afraid to even be seen sometimes with my name in print because, some people take this to the next level, and best case scenario, you get harassing messages. Worst case scenario, someone's waiting for you, right? So I think sometimes the people who want to move the bar, the people who want to introduce other concepts and histories in their entirety, not just kind of this whitewashed version that we have to all speak up, right? Because if we are all kind of cowed to not speak up, then the minority who wants to keep things for the status quo are going to, and by minority I mean, of opinion, we're gonna allow ourselves to kind of stay here. So I think that it does take being bold, and we need boldness in numbers to kind of bring these issues to the attentions of schools that we would like better curriculum, more stories, stuff like that to kind of move the bar. It was a very long answer, I'm sorry, but I hope it touched on the question.
Very well put and thoughtful. So what are some of the ways that federalization of policing create a retreat from the local policing model?
So when we first started policing in this country, we wanted a localized law enforcement, right? And this goes back to Sir Robert Peel in England, right, which is kind of what we based everything on. We wanted localized policing because here's the thing. If you take a cop from Fort Lauderdale, where I grew up, and you plop them down in Jackson County, they are going to have no clue what's normal, what's out of place, what's suspicious, right? It's just a whole different culture. So the more local levels of law enforcement, the more effective that they are because they get to know their community, they get to understand it. Federalization of law enforcement is to some degree dangerous. And frankly, the reason that we had the first police force in England was because the public feared a secret police, and they feared a militarized police. So I think that we need to be very careful with the federalization of police because it is not possible to have a one-size-fits-all model of policing. It's just not. I think what we need is, frankly, to better fund our multi-part agencies, so not just law enforcement, but law enforcement and the other social services that work together to kind of deal with the community. And then we need to work together to kind of get our ground up goals going, right? And bottom up decision making is absolutely what the literature shows law enforcement should be. It shouldn't be, police chiefs driving around and saying, okay, this is what I think is going on. It should be people in the community who are the eyes and the ears on the ground saying, hey, heads up, this is what we see going on. Can we get some support and some backup on that so we can feel safe? Yep.
All right. Just a couple more questions.
Mm-hmm.
So this one's actually from me. So how can we prevent this movement from burning out without, the proper reform that we were?
Well, first and foremost, I think that we need to do, and I mean, this is why I'm so grateful to have this platform tonight, is we need to do a better job of really explaining what this movement is, right? I think when people don't understand that Black Lives Matter is not anti-police, that they are not this radicalized group, that really what they are is an organization that's putting in a lot of time and effort into bringing attention to stuff that needs to be changed. I think that's one. Another thing is, if we could somehow, and I don't even know on a large scale how to do this, but every time you see someone's face, right? Someone's name that has suffered kind of unnecessarily, to personalize that for you. I think it's so hard to just change the channel, and just frankly, we're numb with it. We're numb with seeing this kind of list and this host, and it's a different thing every day. So maybe this is what I'm getting at. I don't think this is going to change unless we realize, gosh, it could be me, right? It could be me with my kids laying on the pavement. I think if it could be me and my kids laying on the pavement, you damn well better believe that I would be showing up to every meeting I needed to make sure that that didn't happen. And so only when these issues become greater than the groups that they're impacting, only when these issues become, frankly, something that we all embrace as, if everyone feels safer, everyone is safer, right? Things only go sideways and things only go south when people feel unsafe and targeted and escalated. So we need to, frankly, change it so that everyone feels like we're in this together. So I think the more people who can speak out, the more people, even if you just educate 3 other people, right? I mean, even if you just say, hey, look, what we need to do is we need to care. And here's the difference. Stop. Well, you can do whatever you want. I'm not telling you what to do, but I would recommend that instead of engaging on Facebook, you sit down with people 6 feet apart, socially distance, post-COVID, who disagree with you, and you have a conversation about it. And during that conversation, you listen, right? With an open heart, with an open mind. You hear what they're saying. I think so often we are already formulating our answers while someone else is talking and we're not hearing them. I think if we hear them and then validate what they say, and then tell them what we say, and they validate what we say, I think that would be remarkable in moving forward. Because frankly, at the end of the day, I don't think anybody wants officers who take the law into their own hands if it could eventually be them who is potentially, right, the victim here. So we need to kind of make people realize that it could be them, because frankly, it really could.
Well, I'll make this the last call for questions, and yeah, this is really exciting that this is we're in the midst of a paradigm shift, really, in how we're treating each other and how we're listening. So if anybody has any more questions, I'll give it another minute. And I'd like to thank you again, Dr. Caravelis. This is definitely a treat for all of us. And
thank you. And I'll say one more thing. You know, in my classroom, I have students from literally every walk of life. I cannot tell you how many different backgrounds. I cannot tell you. I had a student who came from a town of 36 people, right? That was his hometown. At the end of the semester, almost every single person in my class is, you know, fist bumping, elbow bumping, shaking hands with everyone else in the class. And that's because we create the space for them to both hear and to be heard. And so I would just like to encourage you and to challenge you that no one is beyond hearing and no one is beyond education. And so kind of my little hokey tagline that I use in class is don't hate, educate, right? I think if someone says something that we find incredibly offensive and we shut down, I think we're missing an opportunity to explore why they feel that. And usually the roots are fear, right? Fear of change, fear of changing of the status quo, fear of a changing of a way of life, but also just lack of understanding, right? So if we can kind of, with our mindset, recognize, all right, this is what they're putting up and this is what they're really saying, I think it's easier for us to handle that than to just take that as almost like hate speech and then shut down as a result. Very true.
Very true. And this is really our first step to a more perfect union, to say the least, for sure. So yeah, I'd like to thank you again. And if there's any more questions, last call, and I can move it to you, Yatunde, if you have any closing statements.
Yeah, thank you so much once again, Dr. Caravelis, for that wonderful and profound presentation. And I actually think we do have one more question. So it's from someone named Rhonda Kerm. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And it states, is the defund police movement part of the Black Lives Matter movement? And I'll pose that question to you, Dr. Caravelis.
Yeah, so the defund police movement, I'm not even sure that's really its own movement. Does that make sense? I think defund the police kind of became this catchphrase of it's attention grabbing. I'm not sure it was the right kind of attention in terms of, because people don't understand it. It's not clear what it is. It is, so defunding the police, which frankly does not mean stripping them of all resources. It means diversifying the responses, is one of the initiatives that the Black Lives Matter movement kind of puts forth. Now, the other thing I'd like to say in response to that is, again, Black Lives Matter is 50 plus chapters. So there is no single, it's not like the Asheville chapter of Black Lives Matter is going to call headquarters and say, hey, we're talking about these things. Do we have your thumbs up? So a lot of the spin-offs that are kind of coming from this are in the spirit with the movement, meaning the initiatives line up, but if you know how social media works today, sometimes things take off even if they weren't intended to take off. So I think defund the police is one of those things. I don't think it was and I could be wrong here, but my understanding of it is I don't think it was an orchestrated thing. I think it's a phrase, frankly, I think it's a phrase that people took exception to, and that's what picked up the steam and brought it into, kind of the spotlight a little bit. So it is in the spirit of BLM, but not in the way that it has been kind of negatively portrayed, more in the, hey, let's, spread out these services and let's have other agencies handling different things that they're more capable of handling, right? And capable is not the right word, have training for, right? I mean, we expect our police officers to be able to roll into any scene and to know exactly what to do. And I think it's really important to remember that they're just people like us, right? And I mean, that they have basic training and they have situational training, but it would take a lifetime to get the training of all of these different disciplines to know how to handle all of these issues. So I think we are frankly setting them up for failure by expecting them to be the umbrella first response for everything under the sun.
Yeah, I think that's a very excellent point, and it pretty much encompasses what the defund the police movement is essentially about. And so I guess parting words, I would like to thank the audience for the insightful questions and comments. And once again, I would like to thank you so much, Dr. Caravelis. This is a very intense and controversial and ironically divisive topic, and you took it on, and we are very, very grateful.
I was going to say, I'm just so happy to talk to someone because I've been out of my classroom since March. So thank you all for listening.
And also, I would like to thank our sponsors and friends of Folkmoot for their support. And please be sure to visit the donation link or visit folkmoot.org/contribute. And also be on the lookout for a corrected post-event survey via email tomorrow. So, and as an organization, we welcome your feedback, and we also would like to encourage you to check us out. So be sure to visit our Facebook page and our Instagram page for access to resources and way to get connected and informed about the topics discussed in this course, and also to stay up to date on events and programs and all things Folkmoot. And with all that said, I'm going to let you all go. Stay safe and be kind to one another. Thank you once again, Dr. Caravelis. We really, really, really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Bye, everyone. Bye.